Joining me this evening is journalist and writer Angela Levin and political presentation consultant Graham Davies. A very good evening to both of you. We will first of all, though, just remind ourselves what is on the front pages of the papers. The Independent, to start with, says the world is on course for a climate change catastrophe. The Guardian says Tory peers are ready to block most of the government bills to be announced in the Queen's speech tomorrow. The Financial Times says Gordon Brown is putting fiscal discipline at the heart of the Queen's speech and forcing ministers to accept budget cuts. The Queen's speech also the lead in the Daily Telegraph, which says new education legislation has some teachers concerned about a Whingers charter. The Wall Street Journal leads with Barack Obama's first trip to China and the frictions between the two countries over human rights and economic policy. The Daily Mail says 8 in 10 savings accounts are paying such a low interest rate that customers are effectively losing money. The Express says there's outrage that the Prime Minister of Belgium could be appointed the President of Europe. The Sun says the son of Britain's biggest lottery winner is off to fight the Taliban in Afghanistan. And the Times says Marylebone Cricket Club is considering selling the rights to Lords as part of a £400 million redevelopment. So let's take a look in more detail at some of those stories and those inside as well. And let's start with the Queen's speech, which has been roundly condemned already by the opposition. Yes, well, it certainly has, because it seems that none of the bills that are going to go through will actually they're going to be talked about will actually go through. And you have to feel sorry for the Queen. You know, she's over 80. She's got to stand there in her heavy frock and her crown and read things that she knows not going to happen. It's a sort of non-moment, isn't it? David Cameron has said it's just purely a press release. But the Labour Party are putting through 15 bills which cover residential care for old people, control for parents who have difficult children, and a fiscal responsibility plan. And the Lords, the Tories in the Lords are going to block it because there's not enough Labour peers to stop them doing it, 122 to 190. So will they not go through simply because the Tory Lords will block it, or because there's not enough time to complete the programme? Well, it's both really. It's very short. There's only 33 days, I think, of sitting between January and March, and the Lords take 7 weeks to actually go through carefully all the details in a bill. I can feel a bit of overtime coming on.
Well, it's strange that David Cameron seems to be striking a bizarrely intense pose on this, because he accuses Gordon Brown of electioneering and playing politics. Well, really, it's like accusing Roger Federer of playing tennis. I mean, it's a remarkable piece of naive pomposity of David Cameron to expect Gordon Brown not to have an electioneering Queen's speech so short a time before a general election. Well, he could actually call an election, couldn't he? He could do the honourable thing and call an election. Well, that would be like writing a letter of resignation, I think, essentially. Yes, well, it's going to happen. You're only putting off the moment. It'll save him chewing his nails even further down to the cuticle. He needs another 6 months as Prime Minister to tap out his CV for the professional speaking circuit afterwards. You can never second-guess the British public as well. You can't. We know what happened in previous elections, don't we? So, 92, for example. But, you know, this is a difficult moment, isn't it? Because this is a major part of the political calendar, and yet it's already been rubbished by the opposition. You know, Nick Clegg of the Lib Dems also coming out. The attack seems to be faster and more intense than there's ever been before a pre-election Queen's speech than before. It does seem to be sharper. I mean, why not wait and criticise it when you get to debate it on the floor of the House of Commons? Well, I think they're all, not before the Queen stands up and does her bit. They're all very hyped up, aren't they, to be very nasty to each other. I think it's going to be a very nasty personal election, and this is where it's all starting, isn't it? Because they can be ghastly. I mean, there was another point we wanted to make. One of these ludicrous bills, which is a sort of education bill. This is in the Telegraph, isn't it? In the front of the Telegraph, which is almost a joke. It's lots and lots of guarantees for pupils and children, 23 for pupils, 50 for parents. They're going to get a good education, whether they like it or whether they want it or not. They're going to have one-to-one tuition if they're failing, 5 hours of physical education a week, and high-quality cultural activities, whatever that is, if it's not X Factor
or I'm a celebrity or something like that. Otherwise, the parents can take their heads to court. Well, you know, it's absolute rubbish, isn't it?
Ed Balls says that the option of going to court is as a last resort, but there are some professional whiners in this country that will take it as a first resort for the good of their children.
Well, we live in a litigation culture now, so they certainly
will.
Well,
good news for lawyers then, that's excellent.
Fiscal responsibility is going to be one of the keys, isn't it, to make sure we don't get another credit crunch and recession like we have. But it's also going to be a fiscal responsibility within government departments, and already the Daily Mail is talking about a feud between Ed Balls and the Chancellor, a spending feud.
Well, Ed Balls has got a remarkable amount of nerve, bearing in mind that politicians of all parties have been looking to make spending cuts, supposedly, to cut any government borrowings. And of course, he's actually asking for a 1.3% increase over 4 years in his department. And that's just a remarkable piece of comedy on his part. It was never going to be a seriously considered proposal from him.
But actually, in financial terms, it's £2.6 billion increase, which means that all the other departments have to cut by 12% to enable him to do this. And Alistair Darling's knocked him down and said, "Don't be so silly." So they're all fighting each other.
It's almost as if Ed Balls might be after Alistair Darling's job. I can't believe that.
Well, it says here he wants to make education a key battleground with the Tories and portray himself as the champion of public spending. He's obviously coming out of the ranks, isn't he?
He's trying to sort of give himself a different brand to Alistair Darling.
Well, full coverage of the Queen's speech, obviously, tomorrow. All the pomp, ceremony, etc., starting sometime about 9:30, Queen's speech 11ish. Anyway, all there. So do stay tuned and see how short it is, if you like. That's one thing to look at, isn't it? Some suggesting it's going to be 20 minutes, opposed to 40 for the last one. Anyway, we'll see. Let's move on to the Daily Mail, shall we? Savings accounts. This is for anybody who's a saver, should stay tuned for this one.
Yes, this is that savers are the sort of poor relation and they're sacrificial lamb of the Bank of England to save the economy. They've gone through over 700 different types of saving accounts and come up with the average that people earn is 0.78%, which is really very poor. If you think of pensioners who've actually put their money away and are trying to pay their bills on that, which they could do a few years ago. It seems very unfair because it's people who've been prudent, people who've been self-supporting, looked after themselves, and are actually being thrown to the wind, really.
And what's the problem here? That inflation is meaning you're effectively losing money, or that taxation is effectively meaning you're losing money, or both?
Well, they would argue that the way that the current climate is and what they're allowed to do or not allowed to do means that there are very little avenues for them to make a profit. But of course, you look at what they offer you, and I suppose they can still give you the ability to pay bills online. They give you traveller's checks. Apart from that, you might as well have it in a shoebox under the bed, and I think that sort of option is going to look more and more popular.
Is there much sympathy, though, because savers had good interest rates for a very long time, even if it was sometimes with the Icelandic banks, and we know what happened there?
Well, they did, but of course people who are trying to buy a house now find it very difficult to have options to get a mortgage. People who are trying to save find it very difficult to make any money.
I think
there's no winning at either end.
I think there's difference if you're speculating with your money or you're just putting it into somewhere safe to look after and earn a bit. You know, so I think you can get the sympathy. You're not trying to make vast amounts of money in all sorts of dodgy banks. You're putting it in solid banks. This is what people have done for generations. And now it's not working for them.
Well, with inflation rising, maybe interest rates might move eventually. We will see. Let's move on to the Guardian. The battle of the big chocolate manufacturers. What is the latest?
Well, the Italian Ferraro brothers, who brought us possibly the cheesiest television advertisement of the 1990s with the Ambassador and Ferraro Rocher, now look as if they're going to put in a bid for Cadbury's to take them out of the hands of Kraft. So it'd be on a delicious plate you might see Ferraro Rocher together with Crunchies and Hall's Throat Sweets. What a marvellous prospect that would be.
I love Ferraro Rocher. They say here they're very kitsch.
Kitsch? What does kitsch mean?
Well, it means sort of, you know, you shouldn't really do it if you want to be in the smart set. But I think they're delicious, you know, crunchy on the outside, soft on the inside. I think they're really lovely.
I'm more of a Mars bar man myself.
No.
I thought the story was that Ferrero was joining up with Kraft. But anyway, there's going to be this massive conglomerate.
But actually, they're actually worth £6 billion. I mean, I always think the money is very interesting on these. So if they're kitsch, then they've done very well from being kitsch.
Well, they brought into the English language the word excelente from their ads, and I've used it ever since.
They also make Kinder Surprise, which is very popular, so you might have piles of that instead of the
Yes, not all the profits
Rocher.
are in Ferrero Rocher, maybe that's the point. Anyway, we'll see where that story develops. Certainly, Cadbury has been fighting the takeover, hasn't it, for the moment anyway. Anyway, coming up, just what isn't everything? Back in a moment.